I like when you were talking earlier, I was thinking really it's about the individual. We can have job title, head of X, but not all jobs are
Welcome
equal.
back. I'm
So
Kim
the
Hamish.
actual
It's been
job
nice
is
while
quite
this is
different when you
Inside
get
Exec.
into it.
We're
The
continuing our discussion
circumstances,
with
what's
John Gates,
expected, the
salary
current
coach. And
situation
this week
in the
we're looking at
organization,
how
that's
you
on their
assess
side. On
yourself,
the
how you value
individual side
yourself
is
in a
what I
commercial
bring to
market.
it.
And
How am I going
also
to turn it
thinking
around and make
about
it better?
risk
And that's where I think your
an organisation
negotiation with that
taking you on and
person
how you can
will
think
help
about
them
that and
get the
address that
better
within your
salary
interview.
package all up.
Yes, I think you're on the right track, and it's especially true when you rise to a point where there's only one of you in an organization. If you are, let's say you're a software engineer and you are going to work in a department with 20 other software engineers. Now the salary range is much tighter because you're being compared directly to other people in the team. The leadership has to worry about maintaining pay equity across the function. But let's say you're the software engineering director, the head of software engineering, the head of HR, the head of a function. There's only one of you. And now it's the personal variance in skill, experience, the capability, and the value that you're going to bring to the role is much different across people.
Yeah.
So that you can still, as a software engineer, though, you can negotiate on other fronts. The company has pressure to maintain the pay equity, but that doesn't mean salary is the only thing you could negotiate. In the United States, sign-on bonuses are very common.
Yeah.
It's not all that common in some other cultures, but in the United States, it's very, very common. It's the Swiss Army knife of offer deals. So if we find a software engineer that we're trying to hire at 140,000 and they have a competing offer that's at 150, but they really want to work for us, how do we close that gap so that we get a yes out of them? If we're constrained on the salary, then maybe we throw some equity into the deal or a one-time signing bonus to close the gap. There are a lot of fronts you can negotiate on.
Yeah.
So that leads us into the second question that we sent you, and we've talked around it a little bit, but I know there's some other specifics we want to talk about is how do you value your worth in commercial terms? Is there a formula that you use?
That is a great question, Kim, and the answer is there is no formula that I use. I think you can improve your value by drawing this straight line for the interviewers. So, for example, you're interviewing for a position, you want to understand what their biggest, most painful worries, concerns, and problems might be. Maybe they're worried that a particular project will be delivered on time or something like this, right? Then you can say, well, how big of a problem would it be if that project was late? And then you start asking, how much would it cost you or the company or the organization if the project was late? And if that number is a big number, then you're the person who can make sure it's not late. Your value improves. So often interviewers are just trying to find the person that has the skills, and they haven't in their mind drawn a connection to money earned, money saved, revenue expenses, things like this. But once it comes time to get an offer approved, you've selected. I've selected Kim. I want to hire Kim. Now I'm going to have to go through a process with my company to get the offer to Kim approved. If the offer is high, people are going to start asking, well, why so high? You need to give them, like, spoon feed them the financial reason. It makes sense to offer Kim $30,000 extra because she's going to save us $8 million. So that's a skill that people can learn during the interview process to take those problems and just ask the question, how expensive is that problem? Let's try to understand that. And that helps. But there really isn't a formula because every company's different in terms of how they value talent. But I think you're always going to get more money if you can show them how much value financially you're going to bring if they hire you instead of somebody else.
In terms of the economic climate that we're faced with these days, is that a better approach for people who are looking to move around? And is it a better approach as well for those who are interviewing and selecting, is to start basing it? We went through a series of years where everything was based on the job description, and so you had to send in your application based on the job criteria. Are we now looking at moving beyond that and saying, you have to tell us what your value will be in dollar terms, not just in the esoteric terms, but in dollar terms, you tell us what you can do for the organisation? Is that going to make it easier on both sides of the table?
I think so. I think this is how consulting engagements are usually decided over time, right? And a consultant is different than a contractor. A contractor would come, oftentimes it's project work, it's commodity skills. There's a specific rate for this kind of contract work, and it's this much per hour. But if you're a consultant, you're doing a scoping call and you're finding out what are the deliverables. And when I'm a consultant and I'm working with a company on their recruiting process, I want to understand what their problem is first. Then I want to understand how expensive that problem is. And then I'm going to offer to solve it for them for a price. And that price better be less than the cost of the problem. And it usually is by an order of magnitude. So I'm charging $50,000 to fix a $5 million problem. And to them, that seems like a good deal, even if it only takes me 10 hours to do it. So that's an exaggeration for the audience, but consultants do this all the time, and I think employees would be well served to understand how to do this for themselves.
Take on that style of thinking rather than the return on their personal investment of time and time spent in the chair sort of thing.
Using that very same approach, if you're going as an employee, right? There's different components, I realize, but if you use that same approach you used as a consultant, it really will work, because what you're saying is, can you tell me a bit more about the job? Dig deeper into what's the expectation, what the company is at right now and where it's going to be, and then show how much you bring to the value and how you're going to address that particular problem. This way, then you can, when you get that information, you're in a better position to give the salary range as a starter.
Yep. There's a way we can even sprinkle some salt on this and make it even more effective. And that is trying to understand the personal pain points of especially the hiring leader, but this works for peers and other people too. Anybody that's interviewing you, they have personal stakes in filling the position. So there's, on the one hand, there's business value, which we've been talking about. The extra revenue that you're going to create or the expenses you're going to help them to avoid. But there's another layer, and I think it's important. Maybe I'll see some nods on the screen from you guys when this comes out of my mouth. But I think that leaders, in my 30 years of recruiting and all of the interview debrief meetings that I've done, why do you want to hire this person instead of that person? That person's way better. Well, I want to hire this person because the risk to me is low. This is why hiring leaders hire their family, or they hire somebody that is recommended by someone else, or they pick the internal person over the better external person.
We always used to say they choose someone who's like them or someone who's no threat.
Yes, the risk is low. And so what you can do as a candidate to kind of discover this is you can ask, this is another freebie, so if you're listening, write this one down and try it. Ask the interviewer, when you have a chance at the end of the interview, to ask questions. Ask, what would happen to you if you pick the wrong person for this. And then you just be quiet and let them think about it. You'll see the wheels turning. And you don't want to ask what happens to the team or what happens to the company, but what happens to you if the wrong person gets this job? And that will likely lead you to at least a clue as to what their personal stakes are. If you are a leader, one of the worst things that you can ever do is hire the wrong person.
Mm.
That's why this element of risk comes in to play. If you hire the wrong person, what happens to you as a leader? You lose the credibility of your team. Your team is mad because you picked the person that doesn't fit, or the person that's slacking, or whatever. You end up losing 30% of your time dealing with the problems that have just come up. Your boss thinks you don't have good judgment. And if you do that more than once, you're replacing somebody that was a hiring mistake, and then you hire another bad person. Like it's just really terrible. So a leader's job security is on the line when they're making a hiring decision, and that's really important for candidates to understand. So if you can ask them that question, or when it comes to this job, what's keeping you awake at night? What are you losing sleep over? What are you worried about? It helps you to understand their personal pain or their personal point of risk. If you're a peer, you have different stakes. It's like, well, I'm worried that I'm going to have to carry, the worst thing that'll happen to me is I'll have to do 2 jobs because you're not doing yours.
Yeah.
Or the supervisor is, maybe their worst fear is that you'll alienate their biggest customer. And that's going to be a reputational problem for the whole team. And so whatever the answer is, you can say something like, well, if you hire me instead of somebody else, that's never going to happen. You're never going to have to worry about that because. And then you bring in an example from your work history. We had this one customer who was really difficult to handle. No one else could handle them. But this is how they were, and this is how I handled them. And I made sure that they were satisfied 100% of the time. That fear that they have about picking the wrong person, you hit that head on. You have to reassure them that you're not the wrong person.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, this is why so many jobs are posted externally, and they go through they interview 100 candidates and they can't seem to find the right one. And it's because they're looking for somebody that they don't have fear with. And they end up they promote somebody from within. Maybe they're not quite ready, but they're a known quantity.
That's true.
It very much reflects some of a couple of guests we had earlier in the year that were talking about changing the focus of business to being not risk averse, but doing the risk analysis before they did anything else, and being prepared to understand that there's always going to be a risk in some fashion, and what they could do to identify the risks so that they knew what they had to deal with if it all went pear-shaped afterwards.
Sure.
So it's just interesting to hear that is reflected in this approach as well.
Yeah, what's really hard though is to do that risk assessment on yourself. Put yourself in the hiring manager's shoes and look at your work history and yourself objectively. This is why, job hopping is a problem, or being overqualified is a problem, and so on. Most people think, well, that's terribly unfair. I have all of these reasons why I'm not a job hopper. I was laid off 4 times, or it was contract work, or I'm ready to step down from being this to being that. These represent a risk in the mind of the hiring manager.
Yep.
They are worried that if you're overqualified, you're going to be bored, or you're not going to give it your all, or 6 months, you just need the paycheck right now. 6 months from now, they'll be replacing you because somebody else made you a better offer. You have to be honest with yourself first, and then address the elephant in the room. And you have to, again, reassure any point of risk that might come up relating to you. I think that's a great point, Kim.
Well, it's very personal for me too, because I started out my career, I trained as an architect, and the first real work that came my way, because it was unheard of in this country for many women to qualify that way in the 70s, I shall say. So the organisation that first came up in terms of employment was a government organisation. It wasn't in architecture, but it was in construction. And that was their fear in 30 or all of those years ago, that I would be bored, that I would be just looking, this was just the entry point so that I could get into one of the other jobs. And it took me a long time to convince them that I wasn't interested in pursuing what I had. I'd gone to university straight from school. I'd done what I was supposed to do in terms of getting a degree, but I didn't want to pursue it. I had pursued it, and I thought, it's just, for me, I don't want to always have the battle of being the woman in the male-dominated industry. I just want to do something that is related, where I can use the skills that I learned in all of that training. And what has happened all of these years later is that I can now bring those skills, all of the skills, the architecture and the design, and then all of the admin skills that I had, into the passion that I can pursue now. And I'm happy with that. I'm comfortable with that. And I think we don't hear those stories. We don't hear about people who make a decision to not pursue something that they've trained in, but there are other skills that you learn. We hear about the other skills that people learn, but we don't hear the end story of what happened with all of the development in between time. So it's really appropriate for us to be talking about that as well, because I think we have a listening audience that are closer to choosing what they would like to do with the rest of their lives, and that reflection time of looking back and maybe doing an analysis of, I was in this job, I learnt these skills, and that exercise of doing that gives them some sense of what they might be looking for as fulfillment at the next stage that they choose, and then putting their range of dollars on that.
Wow, Kim, you just said so many great things there. I couldn't agree with you more. If you're transitioning from one thing to another, you have some convincing to do. You're going to have to convince them that you are committed to that new course, right? And it's going to take some time to find the person that's going to believe you. That's why it's difficult to transition from one thing to another unless you're already trusted. The easiest path to that, I think, is if you're transitioning from one thing to another with someone who already knows you. They know what you're capable of and what you're good at, and it keeps the risk in their mind to a minimum. But ageism and sexism are alive and well today. They are just as big a problem. Ageism is something that really, really bothers me. And the isms, the ageism and the sexism, is, again, you have a bias in the mind of someone that is creating a belief of risk in their mind. Classic example would be, I'm not sure I want to hire this 32-year-old female architect, because what happens when she gets married and wants to have children? And, that's the classical stupid sexism that happens, right? But I'm exposing the risk that the bias creates in the mind of the person. And the same thing happens when somebody is showing some gray hair. The risk is they're all out of gas. Their best ideas were 20 years ago. They're going to be hard to change their mind about things. They're stuck in their, these are all the age bias ideas that are banging around in the heads of everyone making hiring choices today. Again, if you've got that gray hair, you have to be honest with yourself that this is probably in their head. And you have to be the opposite during your interview. You have to show them strong energy, commitment, new ideas, all that. And you have to defy the bias like really hard. And still you might not win. It's just the most frustrating thing ever.
I will say that Fliana and I laughed at one point when you were talking about that, because she knows the story of when I came back to work after I had my first child. And the first thing the manager asked me when I walked back in the room was, are you here for good, or are you just waiting time till you have the next child? And so that was in 1982. whilst it made me stop in my tracks, it did make me think about what my commitment was to the organisation. And I appreciate that he was that candid with me at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But what he wanted to know, obviously, was the risk of where to place me next in the organisation.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave me a great opportunity. It wasn't the role that I was expecting, but it was a hugely educational role that he put me in, and it set me on a different path, and I will always appreciate that. He did the same, exactly the same thing for someone who came back to work at the same time. She took complete offence at it and took him to the Anti-Discrimination Board and all the rest of those things. At the time, I thought that it was so inappropriate for her to take that action, because it wasn't about her. It was about the organisation, and it was about the risk that he needed to take. Whether she knew it or not at that stage, she didn't know what the answer was to the question. She hadn't thought about it herself, and she certainly hadn't thought about it in terms of the organisation. She just wanted a job back. So I think there's responsibility on both sides to make sure that we follow that through.
Time to take a break in this discussion with John Gates. Join us for part 3, the final part of our discussion next week. But for now, I'm Kim Bailey. She's Fuliana Osborne, and this is Inside Exec.